So let's talk about what you thought the Munich speech by Putin in 2007 signaled.
It was clearly a statement of what Russia under Putin would seek to achieve in the international sphere, that what was perceived, at least by the Kremlin, to be a period in which Russia would be taken advantage of, that Russia was operating from a position of weakness, kind of a rule taker was ready to assert that it could be a rule maker and make its unhappiness with the rules of the game clear. And also I think what you saw with the Munich speech was the beginning of what is now a constant in President Putin's public persona and in Russian foreign policy, which is creating a narrative of what really happened. So this is part of the being a maker of history and not just a taker of history. And so even more than the specific content of that speech, I think it was a turning point in a more assertive, proactive, going on the offensive, and I mean that mostly in a neutral way, but going on the offensive rather than sitting back and being an object of history, actually being an agent of history under the Putin leadership.
By the end of the Bush administration, Hadley says, well, we threw the relationship in the toilet. Had they? Can you give us a critique of where Putin was about America and his second American president that he dealt with?
Well, I wouldn't want to contradict somebody like Steve Hadley, who was in the middle of it all. And I think that's probably fair. I think that the Bush administration had come in with the idea of finding out where you could cooperate with Russia. How do you renew what I think has been a bipartisan foreign policy towards Russia since the end of the Cold War and since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which was a focus on integration of Russia, modernization, whether that's economic, political, security, cultural, social integration and modernization. And the assumption is that there was a Russian leadership and a Russian society that sought that as well. And I think that was a good assumption going in. That's what the Russian leadership in the 1990s did seek. It was the mission, it was the objective, and it had a lot of support in Russia too. So I wouldn't criticize the Bush administration for renewing that commitment, because that was the strategy. The idea was that a Russia that was integrated and modern would be good for Russia, but also in the American national security interests, because that would help contribute to a global order in which the United States' interests were secure and advanced in cooperation with countries like such a Russia. And what the Bush administration learned, we all learned in the 2000s, was the emerging Putin leadership wasn't so sure that they bought into that integration project, that it wasn't quite as willing to play by the international rules of the game that the Russian leadership in the 1990s had accepted, had signed on to, and you began to see fractures in that along the way. And so I think that the sort of frustration that the Bush administration leadership experienced was understandable. I think there was more and more evidence of how difficult that relationship was, which culminated in the Russian invasion of Georgia in August 2008. And so I wouldn't necessarily criticize what the Bush administration's assessment, because I think it was probably a hard-headed assessment of how difficult it had become.
Let's jump forward to 2012 in the post-protest 11 and 12 years. That Vladimir Putin, the freshly ascendant Putin, who is that man in 2012, and how different is he than the man who received the job from Boris Yeltsin?
Well, by 2012, we're always struck by Putin's power and his authority inside Russia, assertive foreign policy abroad. But I think part of the story is exactly what caused that reaction against the Bolotnaya protest, which was the vulnerability of a Russian leadership that actually was facing a society that thought it could make choices. A lot of Russians believe that presidential elections should mean that the citizens of Russia get to choose who their president is and get to hold him accountable. And what the protests showed is that the sort of switch back from President Medvedev back to President Putin, which wasn't a result of anything close to a democratic process, a process in which Russian citizens made their own choices, was a surprise to the Russian leadership and then shook the Russian leadership. That's why you saw that reaction. And I think very clearly the reason why you saw immediate blame being cast on the United States, and in particular in Secretary Clinton, was, it couldn't be from a President Putin point of view that the Russian people didn't want him. That clearly can't be the explanation. So what must be the explanation? If there's something bad out there, it can't be the fault of the Kremlin. It can't be because the image and the model and the plan has some flaws in it, so it must be the United States. And we've seen that again and again and again, not just with the 2011 and 2012 protests, but the loss of Russian influence in Georgia, the loss of Russian influence in Ukraine, the difficulties that Russia was experiencing in Syria by supporting the Assad regime. So it can't be that there's something wrong with the Kremlin's plan and the Kremlin's ability to control domestic and foreign policy. And so the narrative always points to the United States.
Who is that man standing on the podium at the Sochi Olympics, waving to the world? What does that event represent to him?
What you have by 2014 is a Putin leadership that's trying to find a different basis for asserting Russia's stature as a great power on the international stage. If you look at China is reaching great power status based on an incredibly dynamic, growing economy and growing military power. European Union, through its integration, through its leadership in international organizations and the transatlantic relationship, those things weren't working for the Russian leadership. Russia wasn't a part of NATO. NATO enlargement, in principle, was open to Russia, but in practice, was not a path. And so the form of greatness that the Kremlin set upon was a greatness based on sort of a lot of status, certainly a reassertion of military power, big international business deals brokered by the Kremlin. There's sort of this model in which it's not sort of economic growth bubbling up because of competition and innovation and the choices of businesses and business people, but it's mediated, moderated, and blessed and orchestrated by the Kremlin. And Sochi brings that all together. You have, an extravaganza. It's sort of the Russia show, the Putin Russia show, at which he's the main focus, and the images of Russian history, which is a great history, and Russian culture, which is a wonderful culture, and the ability of the Russian society to produce beauty and strength and contribute to global culture. All of that is there, but it's not really Russia that's doing it. It's Putin that's doing it. And I think you see that combination of those two elements really in Sochi in a way that was meant to make the world stand up and take notice. And the world did stand up and take notice because it was quite a spectacle. But it also was a spectacle like much of television or much of media for the moment. And then, the next morning you're going to have to wake up, and it really matters how good your economy is and how dynamic it is and how, your citizens are able to contribute to the greatness of your country. And so Sochi really was, in that sense, very, very symbolic of what Russia under Putin and the Putin leadership is.
So help me understand what he's up against when the first people take to the streets all the way through what happens at the end of Sochi.
So the roots go back into evidence in 2012 and 2013 that the Russian economy was actually slowing down, long before the drop in oil prices, long before the imposition of sanctions. The Russian economy actually was running out of steam, largely because of the failure of the Russian leadership to create the political and market conditions to wean Russia off its dependence on natural resource extraction and sales. And so the extraordinary growth rates that had fueled the early years of the Putin presidency in the early 2000s, the increase in production, much of which was attributable to the return of many oil companies to private ownership, all of that had kind of worked its way through and wasn't a source of economic growth. And so the Kremlin was casting about for a new model of how do you generate some kind of economic growth. And Russia had successfully acceded to the WTO, which was the Obama administration's bet on creating incentives for Russia to become more market-oriented, more competitive, more integrated in the international system. But that requires, again, following the existing rules of the road, the rules of the game, and that creates political problems inside of Russia for favored industries and favored oligarchs around the political leadership. And so it's around this time that the Kremlin comes up with its model of the Eurasian Economic Union, which is going to create, supposedly, increase in growth in the economies of the former Soviet Union by better linking together the economies that had been sort of lashed together during the Soviet period. And Ukraine is key to this in the Russian plan because Russian and Ukrainian economies are so complementary, partly naturally, but partly because of the effects of the Soviet period and the creation of an industrial integration and an agricultural integration between Russia and Ukraine. And so when Ukrainian President Yanukovych is like marching towards living up to his election promise, which was to pursue a European Union association agreement, therefore a free trade agreement with the EU and visa-free travel with Europe, this is viewed in Moscow as a threat to this new initiative to try to re-jumpstart the Russian economy in the face of its decline. And so the stakes became very central to the Putin leadership because if the Putin leadership can't generate economic growth, it can't generate the kinds of goods that shows the Russian people that the Putin leadership is delivering, and it can't deliver the kind of wealth that the Putin Kremlin political power is dependent on, the set of cronies and oligarchs around the political leadership who both support the political leadership and are dependent on it. That money was drying up. And so the stakes of Ukraine joining not NATO, right? So NATO is pretty much off the table at this point. Too many members of NATO are leery about NATO enlargement, and Ukraine as a candidacy. So sort of the fallback for Europe was this very innocuous-looking free trade agreement and and visa-free travel, which looked very European, very values-based, very win-win. And ironically, it actually was viewed entirely in zero-sum terms by the Kremlin. And that was the start in the fall of 2013 about why Putin and the Kremlin went on a no-holds-barred attempt to stop the Ukrainian leadership. Yanukovych, someone who was identified himself as being very pro-Moscow in business terms, but also in terms of his leadership style, shall we say, his actual commitment to the Ukrainian people to sign on to that European Union Association Agreement was a much greater threat to Putin, what you could call Putinism, than many realized at the time. And those were the stakes beginning in 2013.
So into that fray, Putin does things I think that we've seen happen historically. I mean, he lies about what he's doing. There's a lot of fake news. There's a lot of info war stuff. There's everything you can imagine. The little green men, the entire thing. What does it demonstrate to you? What do those tactics demonstrate to you?
I think those tactics were meant to do two things. They were meant to, and they did one successfully and the other not so successfully. The first was to tell a story to the Russian people about what was going on. Russians generally actually were very positively disposed towards Ukrainians. Many Ukrainians and Russians share, heritage, have close family ties. The idea of Slavic brotherhood is genuine in Russian culture and was genuine, I think, in Ukrainian culture. And so you had to explain why this was happening, what was going on. And so then you got all the narrative about fascism and, Nazis and killing children. I mean, the whole set of stories to justify what was going on to the Russian people. And that continues today. If you watch Russian television, this is a constant drumbeat that Ukraine is entirely to blame. The United States was interfering and was behind it. The whole story. That was a big part of it. The other target of that entire operation was to fracture any kind of unified reaction against the Russian intervention. And so the attempt to persuade many in the international community, but particularly try to fracture the unity in the transatlantic relationship, to argue that, this is, again, to react against fascism. The Ukrainians shot first. These are just freedom fighters. No Russian soldiers here. And so it was an information operation, not for the sake of an information operation, but in order to gain certain political objectives, which was to prevent Russia from experiencing or suffering the costs of the foreign policy choices that the leadership had embarked upon, had chosen. And it worked to some extent at first. There was a lot of debate in Europe in February and March and April of 2014. Kind of a lot of, well, on the one hand, well, on the other hand. And you could see kind of the Russia Today narrative seeping into European and even American media. But as the intervention, as the fighting escalated in eastern Ukraine, and as the evidence about direct Russian intervention became clearer and clearer and culminated, unfortunately, in the shoot-down of Malaysian Airlines 17, I think that narrative fell away on the coherence of that narrative fell away on the international scene, even though it's still pretty much held inside of Russia. And frankly, the Kremlin lost that information war at that point. They continue to try to shape that narrative, but the conflicting evidence between direct Russian intervention in eastern Ukraine and that narrative of we've got nothing to do with it and it's all these other bad guys on the ground didn't stand up to Western media standards and to the ability of Western governments to see what was before their eyes and explain it to their populations.
From the Obama White House perspective, is it he knows nobody's going to reach out and stop him, or is it, so in other words, arrogance, or is it he had to do it? In some way he felt no matter what the consequences, he had to go.
So I think what happened from February, when the intervention in Crimea started, up until the fall of 2014, the first major escalation that resulted in the first Minsk agreement in September of 2014, was you saw a set of pretty impressive successes. And Crimea was pretty easy. It was done very quickly. It was clear to us exactly what was going on, but there was that public persona that the Kremlin successfully advanced, that local people taking over buildings, it's freedom fighters, it's not really the Russian military. The Russian military gets to be in Crimea because it has a base in Sevastopol, which actually doesn't explain why you had all these unapproved reinforcements and all these trucks out on the streets. So, there's a sort of, hey, this is working. And then it started to happen also in the Donbass. You had, sort of suddenly armed men showing up, taking over buildings and localities in eastern Ukraine, and successfully fighting against Ukrainian security forces, which for the most part weren't deployed in the east of Ukraine. Historically, Ukrainian security forces had been deployed in the west because that was left over from the Cold War. That's where the military bases were. And it took the Ukrainians some time to move their security forces to the east. So there was this, sort of march of success and deniability that they had been experiencing. And then as the Ukrainian military forces did move, did improve their capabilities, did improve their tactics, and began to push back, Russian and including Ukrainian air support to their ground forces. So helicopter reinforcements, some aircraft reinforcements, and then the Russians started sending in air capabilities, not aircraft, but air defense capabilities to be able to shoot down Ukrainian air forces. And it's in that context that the Russians supplied that advanced missile system right around that time, because they were clearly determined to inhibit the ability of the Ukrainian military to have a combined arms operation with air support to its ground forces, because they were succeeding at that point in pushing the Russian and so-called separatist forces back. They were on the defensive. They were losing. They were pulling back. The Russian forces were. And it is a tragedy of history that at that moment, the Russians decided to supply a more advanced air defense capability. And to this day, we don't know exactly who pulled the trigger, whether it was a local Ukrainian or it was a Russian military team, but it was definitely a Russian-supplied system, and it was in order to shoot down Ukrainian military aircraft, and they got it wrong, and they shot down a civilian airliner.
And then they lied about it.
They immediately lied about it. And they created false film, which they put out on the internet. And then they created false stories about a Ukrainian Sukhoi, air fighter in the air. That was the first instance in which I clearly understood that Russian information operations were not really about trying to convince everybody of an alternative story, but was about throwing up so many multiple possibilities that you confuse everyone. Because Westerners, Americans, and Europeans are reasonable people. We question our governments. We have independent media who will go and ask government officials to probe sort of the official narrative and point out inconsistencies. So we're always skeptical about what that official story is, which is healthy in a democracy and certainly not something to be criticized. But what has happened now is that the Kremlin uses that healthy skepticism and that sort of questioning of authority and authoritative narratives, not to advance a different story that everyone has to accept, because in the end those narratives are full of holes, but to make everyone kind of throw up their hands and say, well, who knows? Sure, it could have been the Russians, but maybe it was the Ukrainians, or maybe it was the Americans. And that has become especially pernicious. And I would say the MH17 shootdown was maybe not the first instance, but it's the first moment I really understood what we were dealing with and how really difficult that was going to be to cope with going forward, and having a sensible foreign policy in dealing with a leadership that uses information in that way.
There is, around this time, the other examples of what they're actually doing. And I know there's a debate inside the American government, from the State Department. We talked to Toria Nuland and others about, we need to arm these people. We need to bring lethal weapons into bear. Where were you on that argument?
I thought the argument was fundamentally misframed, because it was focused on what kind of weapon and are they lethal. All weapons are lethal. The issue is whether they are well-designed or well-suited, I should say, toward improving defensive capabilities. And it's not just the weapons, it's the training, the formation, the tactics, the operations, the deployments that make for a robust defense. And unfortunately, the debate became, do we give them this weapon system or that weapon system? And the debate wasn't where it should have been, which is, what should we be doing to help the Ukrainians over the long term be able to defend themselves in the Donbass, to deter further Russian escalation, because this problem is not going away. This is not, a problem for the summer of 2014. The Russians are occupying Crimea. They've got forces in the Donbass. This is a long-term problem. And unfortunately, that debate, I think, deflected from what should have been the real discussion, which is, what do you do in a in a broader defense effort to help the Ukrainians learn how to build defensive positions. Their defensive positions in 2014 were really flawed. They were as good as they could do at the time. They were, trying to create this while they were fighting very capable Russian-backed and Russian forces. But we didn't focus enough on not just what would make us feel good to give the Ukrainians in July of 2014, but what are they going to need in what turned out to be February 2015, the next time there's going to be a major escalation and assault on Ukrainian lines. And so we weren't ready, and the Ukrainians weren't ready when the Russians escalated in January and February of 2015 in Debaltseve and took that major railroad head. So I regret, and I feel that I didn't do enough to make that a constructive discussion and a constructive debate, and it almost became a sort of prove how tough you are debate as opposed to what do the Ukrainians really need debate. And I do think that was one of the mistakes we made.
Of course, a lot of people in hindsight say, because we didn't stand up there, he felt comfortable coming here in 2016 and messing around in the election. What do you think about and of course the president said, we don't know where this is going to end if we start stepping in there. Where are you on that?
Well, there's the specific question of if we had provided, say, anti-tank weapons to the Ukrainians in the summer of 2014, or maybe the fall of 2014, would that have stopped the Russian intervention in Ukraine? And while I did think we should be improving the Ukrainians' defensive capabilities, including weaponry, to improve the ability of the Ukrainians to defend and therefore increase the costs that the Russian military would have had to pay and make it harder to decide to exploit their weaknesses later on, as they did. I do think that was a mistake, and I do think we should have been willing to do that. I don't, in the end, think it would have caused an end to the Russian intervention in Ukraine. It might have helped the Ukrainians sustain a more defensible line. It might have saved lives. It might have caused stasis on that line of conflict earlier, but it wouldn't have resolved the crisis. So I think you can make an argument that it would have helped the Ukrainians in their defensive capabilities. It would have made them less exploitable. But I don't think there's any evidence to believe that it would have ended the conflict. Putin was not going to say, oops, sorry, shouldn't have done that. Yeah, it was us all along. We're going to get out now. Especially not after creating the narrative inside of Russia. What is he going to say? Sorry, etch a sketch, shake it all up. We were wrong. Pay no attention to the man behind that curtain, and we're just going to walk away. He wasn't going to walk away. So again, I think on the merits of the case, I think there was an argument to help the Ukrainians build their defensive capabilities. But then to claim that somehow that led to everything else and if only we had done that, you would have ended the Ukraine crisis and Putin would have learned his lesson, I think is really, there's no evidence to that. And I think it fundamentally misunderstands, first of all, why the Russians were intervening in Ukraine, and I've already given you my view on that. And then second, the notion that Putin was going to give up in the mission of asserting Russia's, strength abroad, I think is kind of wishful thinking.
Were you in meetings where others argued forcefully with the president about this and made their case? And what's he like around these arguments?
There was a long period of discussion of the options at multiple levels, at sort of my level, the assistant secretary level, at the deputy level, at the principal level, and then fully discussed, full range of options for the president. I mean, it was a well thought through, well discussed process. I do think that some options were not as well developed as they should have been. As I suggested, I thought that the full defense capability option wasn't as well developed as it should have been. But those who had arguments for why providing specific weaponry in a particular moment to the Ukrainian defense forces had every opportunity to make their argument. And, for good or ill, were not persuasive in making the argument. One of the counter arguments that I think was important in the discussion was that if you escalate the capabilities of the Ukrainians, what makes you think the Russians won't put in more forces? Because at the time, as I've suggested, what we saw was as new requirements on the ground presented themselves, the Kremlin figured out a way to put those forces in, whether those were air defense forces, long-range artillery, battlefield artillery, tanks. The Russian military was up to the task of meeting the needs on the ground. And there was a debate about, well, if the Ukrainians have better capability, will the Russians be deterred by the prospect of higher costs, which was some were advocating, and that's a fair argument. It's a reasonable, it often happens in conflict that when faced with higher costs, an adversary will step back. But there was a view on the part of a lot of Russia experts that Putin wouldn't be deterred, and the pattern of behavior supported the argument that in fact they'd put in more. And I think that's the pattern of Russian behavior in Ukraine and then subsequently in Syria really is reason to doubt that Putin would have been deterred and would have stepped back, just because the Ukrainians now had a new kind of weapon system.
What does that tell you about him?
I think the Russian intervention in Ukraine was in a sense impulsive, that Putin saw Yanukovych losing control. He saw Yanukovych sign on to an agreement and then disappear and run away and lose control in Kyiv. So I do think that it wasn't a orchestrated intervention. It was, however, a well-planned and well-thought-through intervention in the sense that obviously there were military plans on the shelf for being able to move in quickly to Crimea, and they quickly did. So in that sense, it was impulsive, but it was an impulsive tactical decision, but it was rooted, as I've suggested, in Putin's long-term understanding of the stakes and the Kremlin's interests in Ukraine. So that's why I don't think there were marginal costs that would have changed that course of action. Marginal costs often altered how Russia intervened. After the MH17 shoot-down, the Russians withdrew those particular highly capable ground-to-air attack missile systems. They also, in Syria, adapted the kinds of aircraft they had in Syria based on battlefield conditions. They're highly professional, highly capable military, but the political commitment didn't change. I think that the calculation that battlefield conditions would affect the political calculation is a misunderstanding, and I would disagree with those of my friends who might have argued, and I did disagree with them at the time, with friends who argued otherwise. Now, sanctions were meant to impose those kinds of costs because instead of causing battlefield deaths, cold-blooded as this may sound, which wouldn't really matter that much to the Kremlin, sanctions cut at what really mattered to the Kremlin, which is money of the people and the companies around the Kremlin and the ability of the Kremlin to pursue that economic growth, which it was increasingly worried about. And so while they weren't substitutes, you could do both. You could do reinforcing Ukrainian defense capabilities and affecting Russian battlefield costs, and you could do sanctions. I was of the view and remain of the view that sanctions cut much more to the heart of what the Kremlin really cared about, and therefore were a much more effective instrument for imposing costs on the Kremlin for its intervention in Ukraine. And I think that it was the prospect of facing escalating sanctions that was more of a constraint on Russian military intervention from 2015 up until the current moment, because the sectoral sanctions really did hurt the Russian economy. And there's plenty of evidence that the Kremlin and business people around Putin are very worried, despite the bravado and claiming sanctions don't hurt. They are very worried about the effects of escalating sanctions. And so the economic sanctions and the willingness of Europe to join with the United States in those sanctions, once it became clear that Russia was directly intervening in Ukraine, became a constraint on the military intervention. It didn't stop them from intervening, but it pushed them towards more covert and deniable methods, which are the methods that we see to this day.
It's the summer of 2016, and here you are at the White House. You know so much about all of these people, and this Ukraine business has been on the front of your desk, I would assume. And then the word is out that the Russians are doing more than just espionage and gathering information from the DNC and other people, but they do seem to be weaponizing it, or at least it seems like they're about to. When do you hear about this?
The concern about Russian activities in the cyber realm came to sort of my level of the government in June of 2016. I am not a cyber expert. It wasn't an area that I had direct authority for monitoring within the U.S. government, but some of my colleagues who did have direct authority in that area began to call on me to say, we're kind of trying to make sense of what we're seeing. And so we started a series of meetings to kind of figure out kind of what's going on here. This is kind of puzzling. What does this mean? Early on, there was clear guidance from our leadership that we should be tracking this. We should be, making sure that the U.S. government has an understanding of what is going on and is able to report to the leadership, including up to the president, what was going on. But that this is a political campaign, an election campaign, and the White House, and in particular the NSC, has no role in politics, stays out of issues of law enforcement, counterintelligence, anything of that sort, and that guidance was consistent up until the election. So it was important to make sure that the work we were doing to understand what we were seeing in this cybersphere did not lead anybody in a policy role outside of the appropriate legal authorities of the policies they were working on.
Had you known or had much familiarity with what the Russians had been doing in all the way back to Estonia and all the way up to the Democratic National Committee? Was it part of your brief?
There is a lot of evidence, and has been for many years, about Russian espionage and intrusion into cyber systems, into emails, into frankly telephones, meetings of many countries, not just Estonia, European countries, countries outside of Europe. This is sort of just generally known. There didn't have to be a meeting where everyone kind of went, oh, wow. It's just known. It's part of their capabilities. It's part of just sort of the world you live in when you know about Russian capabilities. And not just Russian capabilities. A number of countries have these capabilities. So that the activities of various Russian agencies in seeking information is not particularly surprising, and was not particularly surprising, I would say, along the way. The bigger issue becomes how those capabilities were then used in the election.
In June and July, it's until, I think, whenever the convention is, by then WikiLeaks is released and it's out there. Stuff is out there in the open. They've weaponized the information. Does that feel like an important change to you from where you sat?
I think what was different about that is that the U.S. was the target. Release of embarrassing information is something the Kremlin would do periodically inside of Russian politics. It is something that it had done in other countries. So it was less the willingness to use information that was embarrassing potentially against particular targets, but it felt like a new stage in the willingness of the Kremlin to use that information in the United States, yes.
It's June. Not all the intelligence community even agrees that it's Russia yet, but the CIA does, and information is starting to flow. And you're watching television, if nothing else, and getting some information based on your own understanding of Putin and how he acts. What do you think is going on?
Well, the Kremlin had long been angry and pretty vocal in claiming that the United States was interfering in Russian internal politics and regime change, which again was this obsession that the Kremlin had. It saw it in, it thought it saw a pattern in Serbia, in Georgia, Iraq, Libya, and the Kremlin was very obsessed that Russia would be next, and that somehow successive American presidents had it out for President Putin. And so in addition to taking measures internally to protect against that, countering political opposition, countering independent media, being worried about protests, it began to look like what the Kremlin was doing at this point was it was retribution. It's, you interfere in our politics, we're going to show that American democracy is not so solid, that American exceptionalism is not so pristine, and that you too can be vulnerable to interference and chaos and embarrassment in your political processes. And that was kind of an emerging picture in the middle of 2016, which in retrospect was long grounded in this resentment that the Kremlin had about regime change and color revolution. And we saw them complain about it in places like Ukraine, that we were, trying to overthrow Yanukovych, despite the fact that, in fact, what the United States had done was try to negotiate a way for him to stay in power. But that frame was really powerful. And I think it's in that frame to understand the emerging evidence of Russian involvement in electoral processes and electoral systems and in the WikiLeaks information.
It's a revenge impulse.
It's a revenge, and it's an equalizer. You're just as vulnerable as we are. Your democracy also can be manipulated. Also doesn't look so pristine and so strong. And there was a lot of commentary, actually, if you follow the Russian media at the time. They were a lot of Russian government spokesperson, the Russian media, Russia RT, Sputnik, were just gloating after the release of the WikiLeaks, the DNC emails, about how ridiculous American democracy and American democratic processes look.
That's really useful, the extent to which you could talk about what they were doing, how they were talking about it, and how that looked to you, how it resonated with you and resonated in the White House.
Well, I can't remember specific, sort of transmissions of RT or Sputnik, but there was a clear follow-on to the reporting in the United States about concern about the intrusions and the release of materials, and growing concern about, was this being done by the Russian government or orchestrated by the Russian government. There was a lot of commentary in Russian media about specific emails that were embarrassing. I mean, it was all played out in great detail in the Russian media, speculation about the effects on the campaigns and American voters, and the exposure of American voters to, the truth of American democracy as portrayed, of course, by Russian media. So it was a major focus of Russian media, and then official comment from, I wouldn't say constant, but pretty consistent comment from the Kremlin, sort of noting, well, it looks like, you have your own problems with your own democracy. Maybe you should worry about American democracy.
There is in the White House a sense of, we can't get involved in the politics of this. It's too important. Our instinct may be to come out forcefully and do something about this, but we have to be A, certain that it's Russia, and B, careful. Am I fairly characterizing what the impulse was inside the White House?
I think that there were multiple concerns, some that you've articulated, but also, again, I want to reiterate the sense of we are bound by the Constitution and by American law, and we're not going to do anything that is not consistent with our duties and obligations under the Constitution and under American law. And I'll just leave it at that.
And their relationship in those phone calls is very. Is it as you say, candid and frank? What does that mean? I mean, can he call BS on Putin, and is Putin pushed back? And is that how it works with these guys?
Yeah, they would regularly contest one another's presentation of facts, and either dismiss them if you don't want to spend too much time of a phone call kind of going through history and point by point. But sometimes you need to push back and say, no, that's not how it happened, and no, we didn't do that, and yes, you did do that. So yeah, I mean, at times that is part of the content of those meetings, partly to lay the groundwork for then talking about what do we do about it, but also to make clear to the other side that you're nobody's fool.
So where are you now in the development of your thought process about what is happening with the Russian hack, the back and forth? It's a week before the election. Mm-hmm. Where are you in your mind?
Not on October 7th. You mean that's a month before?
We're out, yeah, a month before.
I think at that point it still wasn't clear what the scope of the Russian intervention might be. There were pieces and elements that were referred to in the October 7th statement by the intelligence community. And there were varying views about whether it was focused on the cyber activities, whether there was a broader media element, messaging element. There was now concern about, was American electoral infrastructure itself at risk to some kind of malign actions? And so some of the focus was on trying to figure out whether state electoral systems understood that they needed to take seriously resilience and protection, given how much some electoral systems are dependent on the internet, on electronic methods for tabulating and conveying votes. So there's a whole slew of issues kind of all, I wouldn't say coming together, but there were lots of pieces that you were trying to figure out, again, what to inform leadership, what they needed to pay attention to, what could be done to make sure that on November 8th, the United States was able to conduct appropriate, free, and fair elections under the Constitution. So I would say there were still a lot of questions at that time, and a lot of focus on, what the situation was and what could reasonably be done to make sure that those elections took place as they should on November 8th.
You know what's amazing when you go back and you read the tick-tock of events that happened through there? The idea of Jay Johnson tries to get to the states and say, we have FBI information that says 21 of you are in peril, right? Brennan goes up, and then finally 12 people go up to Congress to try to convince the Gang of Eight and others this is a real thing that's really happening, and it's Russia in the middle of it. Were you by then one of those, or one of those who still had doubts, or were you one of those who said, no, this is actually happening and this is a real thing?
I had no doubts that the Russian government, which is to say the Russian leadership, had decided to intervene in the election. The parameters and the full scope of what that intervention consisted of, I can't claim that I understood at the time. But I was not among the skeptics, and not since the summer was I among the skeptics. I was I felt like I understood and had seen enough how the Kremlin operates to know an operation when I saw it.
There's a period of time, 5 or 7 weeks, before the analysis is done of what actually happened, and the president then announces the sanctions on December 29th in Honolulu, I guess. In that period of time, there's lots of, I would assume, lots of Monday morning quarterbacking, lots of people saying, did we do enough? Could we have done something else? To the extent that you had a role or had a position or had a dog in that fight, can you talk about it?
That wasn't what occupied my time, because at that point, then the focus became, what should we do to prevent the Russians from ever doing something like this again? And so we actually began a policy process, which was, run by the NSC and run by me, by my office, to develop options for a variety of options to prevent this from ever happening again. And actually, that felt right, because this wasn't about attacking one political campaign or another campaign. It was about undermining the core of what America is, which is a functioning democracy in which the American people freely get to choose who their president is. And I think that we all took a lot of energy from that. The Obama administration, we were going to be going out of office on January 20th, but how could we use our remaining time to help protect America going forward? And that's what we spent our time doing, not so much, maybe some regret, some blame. I don't remember being preoccupied with that. I remember working with really smart, wonderful people, some political, some career, all together to figure out what you could do.
What were the options?
I don't want to talk about, private discussions, some of which are classified, but I will say they resulted in the actions that were taken that the president announced at the end of December. And there was a very long list of options of many varieties and many forms that were fully vetted by responsible, excellent professional people inside, like I said, career people and political people of the Obama administration in November and December. And the package that was agreed to was the result of many meetings and a lot of work and very serious thought and involvement at all levels, resulting in the president's decision.
So you weren't holding your breath, wondering what Putin would do?
The measures that were decided upon were chosen and decided upon in full recognition and expectation that the Russians would at least reciprocally retaliate. At least. And given past practice, diplomatic practice, which is kind of a funny thing to say because it's not very diplomatic, but given past diplomatic practice, probably would asymmetrically retaliate, kick out more people from the U.S. embassy and so on, close more U.S. facilities, impose their own sanctions, so on and so on and so on. And we were fully expecting that, and Russian officials indicated at the time that get ready, the retaliation is going to be big. In fact, Foreign Minister Lavrov said it publicly. So we were fully braced for that and actually planning a series of meetings to figure out how we cope with the retaliation that we expected to be unleashed the next day or in the next coming days. And we were very surprised. I was surprised to come in the next day and find out they weren't going to do anything. And Putin said, no, we're not going to do anything. That was surprising.
What did that tell you?
It was puzzling. Why would they not do what they said they were going to do, which is retaliate? Why would they not do what is common diplomatic practice, which is to retaliate? Why would Putin not do what he normally does, which is hit you back harder? It was puzzling.
So when you look back on all of it, did Putin win, or has this been a big loss for him?
I think that in two ways, the Kremlin didn't get what it may have been aiming at by intervening in the election. Substantively, U.S. foreign policy on Russia is not a function of just one guy or girl, but so far guy at the top of the American political system. They mirror image. They think U.S. government is run the way the Russian government is, and Putin can decide to intervene in Ukraine and cover it up. He can decide, all kinds of things, and everyone has to just jump in and execute his choices. They don't really understand that there are checks and balances, that the President of the United States represents the whole country and the national interests of the whole country, not just his own, sort of momentary preferences or ideas, and that the foreign policy of the United States is really the foreign policy of the whole United States. And the problems that exist between the United States and Russia in our foreign relations are now fundamental and probably going to be long-standing and are going to be a challenge for successive administrations in the United States. And I think that has taken them by surprise. And we're seeing that, in the daily reports of Congress asserting its authority on budget, on sanctions bills, on a whole host of issues. And I think that was surprising. I think also, I don't know if this is that I think it or I hope it, I think that the Kremlin's going to find out that, while it was embarrassing, probably, to individuals or Democratic Party or, many, to expose some of the information or behaviors of individuals or actors in the U.S. elections. In the end, actually, the American electoral system and political system is resilient and will continue and protect itself and rebound. The processes of the U.S. Constitution will make sure that we have free and fair elections again in 2018 for congressional elections and in 2020 for presidential elections. And so in that sense, there was a tactical victory, but there isn't a strategic victory, because the challenge that the Kremlin faces of a United States that actually is capable of balancing policies and national interests and investing in American strengths is still there. And I think they're actually beginning to see that. I think you're beginning to see that in a lot of the Russian commentary about and concern that many of the challenges they were facing that they didn't like aren't going away, whether that's Ukraine, whether that is the difficulties of the Russian economy in coping with a globalized, competitive environment. I don't take any particular pleasure in that. I actually continue to believe that the United States would be best served by a Russia that was integrated, modern, successful, active member of the WTO, all of the package that was on the table at the end of the Cold War. And I continue to believe that would be the best Russia that's good for Russia, too. But we're just not going to get there for a while because this Russian leadership doesn't embrace that project, and they're going to have to sort it out. And it's going to take a while. It's not going to get done quickly.
You've told us, though, that Putin, apparently for 18 years, has had this obsession, and that you called it, and has believed this untrue thing about the West, and specifically the United States, that we are meddling and interfering and trying to get regime change. How could he have held on to such a thing for so long? I mean, didn't we ever try and tell him, look, just, this isn't true?
Yes. President Obama told President Putin multiple times, it's not true. The United States doesn't foment color revolutions. The United States is not trying to overthrow the Russian government. But President Putin probably doesn't believe foreign sources of information as much as he believes his own internal sources of information. And if his own system is telling him that this is going on, and we have public evidence that that's the case, that there's discussions in the Russian Federation Council and in the Duma about so-called supposed evidence, for example, that the United States was involved in the overthrow of Yanukovych. Despite all the evidence that Yanukovych wasn't overthrown, he ran away, it doesn't matter if that's what the Russian political and intelligence system is feeding him.
This is why the Victoria Nuland phone call, sort of matters in some way, because he hears that and it's prima facie.
Yep, that's right.
Yep, what?
It goes through a filter of, well, what does this mean? And the frame is, well, this means the United States is trying to, overthrow the Yanukovych government, which wasn't true, but that's the frame in which it is filtered. You're absolutely right. It's a huge challenge. Eventually, the challenge gets addressed through more interaction. We did advocate and push for strategic stability talks with the Russian government because of the concerns about miscalculation in the military sphere specifically. But we were not successful in getting Russian agreement by the end of the Obama administration. And I really hope that the Trump administration continues that effort, because strategic stability talks aren't arms control discussions. It's not about agreeing to a new treaty, although that should be an end goal, of course, of any kind of talks like that. But simply being able to share information, which may not be believed the first time around, but building on a base of sharing information about military activities really is important, and it's something that we tried to achieve, but weren't able to achieve in the months that were left to us in 2016.
So what does it say about Putin that in the 21st century, this guy holds on for almost 2 decades to something that's not true? I mean, what does it say about the system that he exists in?
I think it's a vulnerability of all authoritarian regimes. They don't have independent sources of information. If leaderships go after those in their own societies who tell them things they don't want to hear, the tendency is to not try and go and tell the leader that they're making mistakes or it's not the way they think it is. That's one of the advantages in a democracy. We may not like the messiness of independent media, may not like, sort of being reported on and being questioned as a government official, but it means that governments in democracies can self-correct because they're accountable and because they can be confronted with facts and not just narratives or convenient stories. And authoritarian governments, including Russia, but not only Russia, are very vulnerable to this sort of echo chamber where good information, you can't make good policy if you don't have good information. And that is a long-term vulnerability of many authoritarian governments. It helped bring down the Soviet Union because the Soviet system refused to recognize the flaws of the Soviet economy. It took a long time for the Soviet Union to recognize the costs of the intervention and the failure of the intervention in Afghanistan. And that helped to undermine the Communist Party and lead towards the end of the Cold War. So absolutely, that is a flaw, a danger. Ironically, it's a danger to the Kremlin, but it's a vulnerability that the Kremlin itself has built.